All right, the Korean War, part of our Cold War segment. This will be, I suppose, during the 50s, one of the bloodier instances of the Cold War. So we'll cover that today. It's called the Forgotten War, but we'll make sure we don't forget anything today as well. So, background to the Korean War. In the year 1910, Japan will take over Korea. There is still hostility to this day for Japan doing that. Okay, a large part of it has to do with World War II and what the Japanese military will do, but a large part of it also has to do with Korea did not want to be taken over, and they were taken over. So, for 35 years, Japan will control that. So, in today's context, right, we know that President Trump's been meeting with the leader of North Korea, trying to convince them not to develop a nuclear program. We know that the leader of North Korea keeps testing missiles, and he keeps shooting them towards Japan, and there's a reason for that. And this is the reason, right? Koreans still don't largely like the Japanese. And a big part of that, which is not on here, which I'll just reiterate from our World War II lectures, is that the Japanese military tended to systematically abduct girls and force them into sexual slavery for their military. They call them pleasure girls, which is another big reason why there's still anger between China and Japan, because Japan did that to Chinese women as well. Anyways, in 1949, Korea will be officially partitioned, so it's independent nominally for about 4 years, but not really, okay? Because during this entire time, there is not an American military presence, but there's an American-supported military presence in the south, and there is a Soviet military presence in the north. So, Korea is partitioned or split in half at the 38th parallel. North Korea is controlled by the Soviet Union, or I should say, mainly controlled, but there's people in charge. There's Koreans in charge of North Korea, but they're handpicked by the communists. South Korea will be controlled by the United Nations, technically, the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. The United States will move most of our personnel out because we did not think that Korea was essential to our defense in the Pacific, but that will change very quickly. In the year 1950, the North Korean army invades South Korea, which quickly overwhelmed them, and they'll take over almost the entire country. The United States and the United Nations will condemn the attack. The UN will vote to send a peacekeeping force to restore balance, and the United States will be most of that peacekeeping force, about 80% of it. Also, an American, General Douglas MacArthur, will be put in charge. The mission here of the UN troops was to restore South Korea. It was to put Korea back to where it was before the communists invaded. Okay, now, real quick before I move on, we know that the United States never entered the League of Nations after World War I. And a big reason why the United Nations, or not the League of Nations, why that wasn't very useful, was that the League of Nations could not generate any military force. The United Nations, however, can. They can ask countries to send troops or to put troops in their charge or whatever. And this will be the first time that the UN uses troops, or at least on a large scale. So, on the left we see the North Korean advance. Seoul is the capital of South Korea to this day. They will overwhelm Seoul. And they'll fan out all around, you can see there in blue, around Pusan. That's what we call the Pusan perimeter. North Korea Reds declare war, you see there, and then you can see North Korean troops in the bottom right marching southward. So, first question for this lecture, why did Americans join the Korean War? Was it A, to protect American interest in our largest naval base? B, Americans wanted to protect South Korea from a communist invasion? C, to protect Korea from Japanese invasion? Or D, we wanted their resources? So, here's the leadership during the war. On the left, Kim Il-sung, which was the North Korean communist leader. On the right, Syngman Rhee, who was a businessman that we helped prop up in South Korea. Syngman Rhee was not a particularly great person, did not have particularly great support in the area, was not very good to the people of Korea, was not the smartest person for us to put our money behind and our might behind, but he'll be the person that we prop up. All right, so prior to the invasion, the U.S. had publicly refused to supply South Korea with troops and weapons. The Soviets kind of did the same thing, but they were more willing to help supply the North. The U.S. did, however, more covertly support the South while pulling almost all their combat troops out. So this starts something that's very modern, something we still do. So we take troops out, but we send in quote-unquote advisors or quote-unquote contractors. So, in the news now, we're talking about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. The Afghan government doesn't particularly love us being there right now. Big negotiation going on between the Trump administration and the Taliban. And also in Iraq. Iraq doesn't particularly want us around after we assassinated Soleimani in their territory. So, we're talking about moving large amounts of troops out. That doesn't mean we're not going to leave people behind. And a lot of the people we leave behind we call advisors or contractors. These are, for the most part, military personnel who just aren't actually fighting. They're just advising or teaching others how to fight. So we'll send thousands and thousands of them in and say, hey, we're not sending troops, we're sending advisors. But at the drop of a hat, those advisors could become troops. We do the same thing in Vietnam. We still do the same thing to this day. So those are words for you to look at, advisors or contractors, when we talk about the military. Now, there's no dispute that North Korea invaded first, right? No dispute at all about that. But North Korea, or the communists there, will use the Jeju massacre here as their pretext, why they needed to invade. So, elections had been promised for May 10th of 1948, elections that might reunify the country. But the elections would only be held in the southern half of Korea because it was under UN control. So the UN said, hey, we're going to hold all these elections, these people are going to rule over the Korean Peninsula, blah, 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 blah. But the communist North will not be involved in this because they're not under UN control. So there's going to be protests, okay? This election would almost certainly, obviously, it's going to put in charge whoever the US and the UN were pushing to lead South Korea. That would be Syngman Rhee. Not necessarily who the South Korean people wanted. So, in the South, there was a South Korean Labor Party, okay, the SKLP, which was a communist political party. It had been outlawed. The U.S. occupation forces, the UN forces at our behest, outlawed communism. It will hold protests itself on the island of Jeju, and it will attack the local police. It will attack rightist youth groups, okay, on that island. So the South Korean government, what are they going to do? They're going to overreact. Okay, they're going to use especially cruel methods to suppress the protests. They're going to kill between 14 and 30,000 people. Between 14 and 30,000. That's 10% of all the people who lived on that island were killed to put down this supposed communist uprising. The U.S. military will document it. They'll be there, but they will not intervene. They will not stop anything. So, the North is going to use this as pretext, saying, hey, look what they're doing to communists in the South. They're massacring them, so we have to invade to protect them. I'm not saying that's right or wrong or anything like that, but we need to understand why they did some of the things that they did. So, picture on the left, that pink island there at the bottom, that is Jeju. In the middle, a bunch of prisoners. And on the right, what happened to those prisoners? They were systematically massacred. All right, so how many people were killed on Jeju? Was it between 500 and 1,000? Between 5,000 and 10,000? Between 14 and 30,000? Or more than 30,000? All right, so U.S. and UN invasion. In 1950, under MacArthur's leadership, the United Nations will launch a surprise amphibious landing at Incheon. I'll show you that on a map here in a second, but that'll be behind North Korea's lines. Within 2 weeks, the United Nations had recaptured all of South Korea and forced the North Korean troops to retreat. So they're past the line, they're past the 38th parallel. So what do? Do we stop there? That's what the UN wants us to do, is to stop right there. But we don't. MacArthur ignores the United Nations and he will invade North Korea. And he pushes them almost all the way to China, to the Chinese border. China obviously doesn't like that. So they are going to send 300,000 troops to support the North Koreans. They'll flood across the border and they will push the United Nations forces all the way back past the 38th parallel. From then, basically on, we're fighting along the 38th parallel. So, you can see on this bottom left map, that long arrow shows the amphibious invasion at Incheon. And then the smaller arrow to the right shows our land forces moving from Pusan up towards Seoul. In the middle there's General MacArthur witnessing the amphibious invasion from a boat. And on the right, there are the Chinese forces once they invade to push UN forces back. So, how many Chinese troops reinforced North Korea? Was it A, 100,000? B, 300,000, C, 1 million, or D, none, because China remained neutral? So, what do we do now? China's in the war. How do we deal with China? Truman and MacArthur are going to face very tough and difficult decisions, and they're going to come to different conclusions. President Truman decides he wants a limited war, just in Korea, just where we were supposed to be. He does not want to invade China. He says, let's keep the North Koreans past the 38th parallel, and that's the plan. That's what the UN wants us to do. We're technically UN troops right now. That's what we should do. MacArthur, on the other hand, wants to invade and nuke China. He draws up plans to drop more than 100 nuclear bombs on China and kill something like 200 million people. He'll disobey Truman's order. He demands that North Korea surrender unconditionally right now. So what does Truman do when his general in the field disobeys him? Truman fires him. So MacArthur gets fired. This is very, very, very important. Here in America, we believe in civilian control of the military. The president is in control of the military. The president isn't a soldier. The president is a civilian. Civilian oversight is important. As we look back in history, we look presently right now, countries where the military rules tend not to have as many rights as when civilians rule. So this is important, that Truman reinforces this. So, with all that said, MacArthur comes back to America and he's still a hero. He gets a huge parade when he comes back. Truman will suffer a little bit politically for this, but he probably made the right decision. So, MacArthur fired by Truman, you can see there on the front page of the Milwaukee Journal. On the left, the two men shaking hands. On the right, the parade that that MacArthur came back to. Okay, ticker tape in the air, being chauffeured around by the police. Lots of people lining the streets to cheer on MacArthur. All right, so the ceasefire. Fighting will continue for a couple more years, and there'll be no real gain in land. There'll be lots of people dying for no reason at this point. Negotiations for a ceasefire begin in 1951 and will last for 2 more years. In 1953, the ceasefire will be officially signed on July 27th. It is still in effect today, which means that the countries of North and South Korea are still at war. They have not signed a truce, they've not signed a treaty, they are just still in a ceasefire. The country is still split at the 38th parallel, where they started. And for all of that, 54,000 Americans will die. 3,000 UN soldiers will die. 103,000 US and UN soldiers will get wounded. 2 million Korean civilians will die. And over 1.5 million North Korean or Chinese soldiers will die. So lots of people are dying for not much outcome here. Now the argument will be that we contained communism, we kept it from spreading any further, and I guess that's technically accurate, but a lot of people are going to die for that goal. So on the left, that's what Korea looked like before the North Korean invasion. In the middle, what it looked like before the UN and US troops got there. Then on the November 25th there, third from the right, it shows how far we got up, almost all the way to the Yalu River, which is what separates North Korea from China. And then on the far right, what we end up with at the end, after the Chinese force us back down past the 38th parallel, and all that sort of stuff. So really nothing gained for all those lives lost, except for, I suppose, we stopped communism from spreading to South Korea. So, Cleveland Plain Dealer announces that Korea armistice is signed and hostilities will cease. Again, it's an armistice, which is a fancy word for a ceasefire. It is not a treaty. It's not a truce. The war's still going, technically. Now, you can see 3 tables there on the right. There's an American table, a South Korean table, and a North Korean table. Those are all the signatories on the ceasefire, which means that if North Korea and South Korea wanted to sign a peace treaty, America would have to be involved because we're an original signatory, original signer of this ceasefire. But on the right there, they met at those 3 tables for 3 years straight, trying to negotiate this truce. Or not truce, I should say, this ceasefire, this armistice. So, how many Korean civilians died in this war? Was it 150,000, 500,000, 1 million, or 2 million? One thing we don't talk about enough when we talk about war is how many civilians die. Back-to-back questions. This war will kind of end with the signing of what? Was it A, a ceasefire or an armistice? Was it B, a truce, C, a treaty, or D, an agreement? All right, some pictures. We have a Korean War memorial, Korean War monument in Washington, D.C. Took a picture of it here. You can see all the stuff that they've got for it. All right, so what happens after the war? We'll talk about both countries briefly here. North Korea continued as a communist nation built on Stalin's principles for the Soviet Union. And they'll be propped up mostly economically by the Soviets sending them money or buying things from them. They will stress independence and self-sufficiency, what they call juche, which is still super important to the people of North Korea. I personally, as an opinion here, think it's a bit of an out for the North Korean government to tell their people that they have to be self-sufficient all the time. That kind of just lets them out of helping them more, but that's just my opinion. They will focus on building a heavy industry economy, mostly through military and agricultural stuff. So they're going to build heavy industry things. They're going to build trucks and equipment for heavy industry. That only lasts for so long, I should say. Initially, for 17 years, their economy is going to grow at the same pace as South Korea. So, as part of this Cold War thing, their communist economy grows at the same pace as South Korea's non-communist economy. But theirs will crash in North Korea. They had borrowed too much money from foreign nations, mostly from other communist nations. They hoped that they could sell oil because they have some oil there to pay off their debt. That didn't happen. They had maxed out their capacity for heavy industry. Nobody needed to buy it. They had already had as much as they needed. And so that part of their economy is going to crash as well. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and this puts the North Korean economy again into free fall. It sort of stabilized a little bit, but they needed Soviet money to stay afloat, and they couldn't get it anymore. Added to all this will be a series of floods and droughts known as the March of Suffering. Somewhere between 600,000 and 3.5 million North Koreans will die of starvation or hunger-related illnesses between 94 and 98. And we don't know how many because North Korea won't give us the official numbers. We eventually start sending them food, but for a while we held that food as sort of a political carrot. But we eventually got away from that. Now they've been developing nuclear weapons for a long time. It's a huge diplomatic issue. Why do they want nukes? Because, very simply put, countries with nukes don't get invaded, and they don't want to get invaded. However, there's been some moments where we've been a little bit better towards them, some where we haven't. President Trump tried to restart negotiations, but that's hit a standstill for a pretty long time, and especially with the coronavirus stuff that's going on right now, I don't think we're going to address that for a while. So, all of the Kims, okay, the first Kim, the second Kim, and the current Kim there on the right, Kim Jong-un. What happened in South Korea? It'll develop as a capitalist nation. Initially, for its first 15 or so years, its growth was very, very slow. But from the mid-60s until now, it's developed into one of the top 20 economies in the world. It's basically followed the same policies as Japan. We talk a lot about nation building, America helping build other countries in other parts of the world. Our two greatest examples will be Japan and South Korea. Okay? They are one of our largest trading partners. They're strategically important to us militarily. There's 24,000 to 26,000 troops stationed there. As an aside, the South Koreans don't really control their military. We control their military. We helped write that into their constitution. So it's important to us there. But there's still a debate, you know, how many troops should we keep there? Is it worth it to have that many troops there? Should we pull some back? Should we deploy them to other areas? But we have a lot of troops. On the left here, this map, it shows a whole bunch of different places where we have lots of troops. In the middle, the demilitarized zone, this is an animation of it, but literally the things are blue, and as we can see there, in yellow, there's an arrow that points to it, that's the demarcation line. So in the middle of these buildings, that's the split between North and South Korea. There are meetings held in these blue buildings, negotiations had, stuff like that. On one side, South Korean and American troops stare out to the other side, which is full of North Korean troops. Every once in a while, a North Korean troop might defect. That happened a couple of years ago. But for the most part, the negotiations are held within those blue buildings. That's kind of where we are right now with the Koreas. One book I would recommend to you, I read a couple of years ago, it's called Without You, There Is No Us. It was written by this woman here, Suki Kim. She pretended to be a missionary teacher at this university, the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, which is where the elites of North Korea send their kids to learn. She secretly kept journals and notes. she secretly kept journals and notes of all of her activities there to kind of write about what North Korea was like from her perspective. She's a little bit too gung-ho about military stuff intervening there, which might not particularly work out with some of the other realities on the ground, but it does give you a really great inside look about what North Korea is actually like. Anyways, that's the end of our Korean War lecture. Okay, there'll be a quiz attached to this. Take your quiz.